They say freedom is the oxygen of democracy, but right now the air is thinning. Washington is puffing and wheezing, telling us everything is fine, but history is whispering something far more troubling. The structures we trust to protect freedom may be quietly eroding it. When I look at the corridors of power, I don't just see lobbyists, bureaucracies, or politicians. I see the walls closing in on what it means to be free. And I'm here to tell you, with the clarity of someone who has built rockets that defy gravity, cars that defy convention, and satellites that circle the globe connecting corners of the planet, that the threat is real, and the consequences are immense. I've always believed in pushing boundaries. From launching SpaceX rockets to pioneering Tesla's electric vehicles, from building Starlink to connecting the most remote regions of the planet, my career has been defined by challenging the status quo. But none of that technological frontier matters if the political frontier collapses. Because if your vote doesn't matter, your speech is muted, and your ability to dissent disappears, then the rockets sit on the pad, the cars idle in garages, and the satellites spin silently in orbit. The future, as exciting as it might be, becomes irrelevant if freedom itself is under siege. Consider what's happening right now in Washington. Decisions are being made that shift power away from the individual and toward institutions. Institutions that often answer to politics, bureaucracy, or moneyed interests, not the citizens they are meant to serve. Freedom of speech is being squeezed, not obviously with a giant censored stamp, but quietly, insidiously, through fear, algorithms, and social pressures. A democracy doesn't always die in a dramatic coup. Often it fades slowly, like sunlight being blocked by encroaching clouds, until the people barely notice they're living in a shadow. And let's not kid ourselves. This erosion is happening under the guise of protection, security, and efficiency. You're told it's for your own good. We'll regulate to keep you safe. We'll moderate to keep you civil. We'll track data so you're protected. But increasingly, the we doing the protecting is not you. The we is them. The bureaucrats, the lobbyists, the contractors, the elites who benefit from control rather than freedom. In the private sector, I've built companies that challenge the status quo. I've fought monopolies, disrupted industries, and taken risks that many deemed impossible. And through all of it, the guiding principle was always clear: the individual matters. The citizen, the employee, the customer, they matter. But the danger now isn't only inside Silicon Valley or Wall Street. It's in Washington itself. The very mechanisms meant to preserve freedom are increasingly being used to corrode it, subtly, structurally, and pervasively. Think about it. Massive mergers of state and private technology, platforms that dominate the conversation, governments outsourcing decision-making and accountability. These are not abstract concerns. They are real, immediate, and increasingly intertwined. When the entity controlling your communication channels also controls the narrative, whose voice wins, yours or theirs? And when that narrative is curated, regulated, or algorithmically controlled, you might think you are free while your choices, thoughts, and expressions are quietly shaped by forces you cannot see. When I speak of freedom fading, I don't mean it in a dramatic, hyperbolic way. I mean it in a practical, observable way. You may not even notice until it is gone. One day the mechanisms and processes you trusted to safeguard liberty will have been repurposed, and the restrictions will feel normal. The very platforms, institutions, and systems meant to protect you will define what is permissible, and by then, it will be too late. It's not science fiction. It's history repeating itself under new names, with new tools. This is why I'm warning Washington. Neutrality is no longer enough. Bystanders are complicit. Inaction is consent. If you value freedom, defending it is urgent, not optional. You cannot wait until a crisis forces your hand. The systems of power have a momentum of their own, and the longer you delay, the stronger they become. Democracy, liberty, and free thought are not self-sustaining. They require constant vigilance, active protection, and courage. Freedom, fundamentally, is messy. It allows for dissent, for disagreement, for failure, and even for mistakes. That messiness is not a flaw. It is the feature that keeps systems alive and vibrant. But Washington increasingly seeks order over chaos, control over liberty, and conformity over creativity. And when that happens, what appears to be stable is actually brittle. Like ice under the sun, it may hold for a time, but it will inevitably crack. I've built companies that defy gravity, literally and figuratively. But the gravity of political power is different. It is subtle, persistent, and all-consuming. It pulls everything toward centralization, regulation, and control. It operates invisibly, through policy, through contracts, through the architecture of decision-making. And the most insidious aspect is that it presents itself as protection, progress, and order. That is why I say, pay attention. Because if you don't, the freedom you take for granted today may be gone tomorrow. When I launched SpaceX, many said it was impossible, that the odds were stacked against us. When I built Tesla, people laughed at the idea that an electric car could be desirable, practical, or profitable. I ignored the naysayers because I believed in possibility, and more importantly, in the individual, the customer, the innovator, the thinker. Now, when I look at the political landscape, I see the same naysayers trying to convince everyone that freedom itself is negotiable. I reject that notion. Freedom is not just an abstract ideal. It is the foundation upon which innovation, creativity, and progress are built. Without freedom, you cannot explore new technologies, challenge assumptions, or pursue ambitious goals. You cannot dream of colonizing Mars, creating sustainable energy systems, or connecting billions of people through global communication networks. Without freedom, the rocket never launches, the car never drives, the satellite never orbits, and society stagnates. So my warning to Washington is simple. You have been warned. Do not mistake silence for consent, apathy for acceptance. Every day that you delay defending freedom is another day you empower inertia, bureaucracy, and centralized control to consolidate their grip. The stakes are high because the cost of inaction is the slow, almost imperceptible death of liberty itself. And when liberty dies, even the most impressive technological achievements mean little, because they will exist in a society where choice, voice, and innovation are constrained. Freedom is fragile, but it is also resilient. It can survive, grow, and thrive, but only if those who recognize its value act decisively. And that is my message. Stay alert. Stay engaged, and never assume that someone else will defend what you hold dear. The future will not wait for your consent, and the systems of power will not yield it voluntarily. If you do not act, you will find yourself living under conditions you never agreed to, and cannot easily reverse. History has shown us that democracy and freedom are not guaranteed. They are earned, fought for, and defended. Every generation has a choice: to preserve liberty or to let it slip away under the guise of order, security, and efficiency. The time to act is now, because if you wait, the institutions meant to protect you may be too entrenched, too centralized, and too controlled to ever truly return to the principles they were founded upon. So pay attention. Speak up, engage, vote, challenge decisions that limit your voice. Demand transparency from those in power. Freedom does not survive by accident, and the future of our democracy is in the hands of those willing to protect it. Remember this: the oxygen of democracy is freedom, and when the air thins, every other achievement becomes meaningless. And that ultimately is why I am warning you. The air is thinning, and the time to act is now. The warning I gave, freedom is fading faster than you think, was not an exaggeration. It came from observing closely and carefully how power flows inside Washington, how decisions are made behind closed doors, and how processes that were once designed to protect citizens are being repurposed, subtly, to control them. This is not a hypothetical scenario. It is happening in real time, under the radar of public scrutiny, and it is urgent that the people in positions of authority, and the citizens they serve, recognize it before it's too late. Washington today is full of skilled administrators, intelligent analysts, and clever politicians. They know the letter of the law, the frameworks of bureaucracy, and the mechanics of governance. But knowing procedures is not the same as preserving freedom. I've watched this happen over and over in the private sector. Systems designed for one purpose slowly evolve to serve a different one. Efficiency becomes control, protection becomes limitation, guidance becomes manipulation, and the individuals these systems were meant to empower become invisible, silenced, or corralled into compliance. In Washington, I see similar patterns. Agencies that once served the public good increasingly serve their own interests, or the interests of those who fund or influence them. Decisions are outsourced to contractors, advisors, and think tanks, whose motivations are not aligned with the citizenry. Regulatory frameworks that were meant to protect liberty are instead deployed to constrain it, often under the guise of innovation, security, or national interest. The tools of governance, if not carefully monitored, can become instruments of control. I want to be clear, this is not a partisan observation. This is a structural one. Freedom does not belong to a party. It belongs to the individual. And it is the individual, not the institution, who ultimately suffers when systems become opaque, unaccountable, or centralized. Freedom is messy, inconvenient, and often unpredictable. But that messiness is its lifeblood. When you smooth out every wrinkle, when you sanitize every risk, when you centralize every decision, you destroy the very thing you claim to preserve. Consider technology's role in this. I have spent my career developing cutting-edge technology. SpaceX is about rockets, Starlink about global connectivity, Tesla about sustainable transportation. But none of these ventures would exist if people weren't free to innovate, to take risks, to challenge authority. Technology magnifies human capability, but it also magnifies control. When algorithms determine what we see, when data is harvested to predict behavior, when platforms shape the discourse, the line between guidance and coercion becomes blurred. And when government merges with these technologies without transparency, the consequences are amplified exponentially. The question in Washington, therefore, is not whether technology is powerful, it is who controls it. Is it the citizen? Or is it a combination of government agencies, private contractors, and tech conglomerates whose accountability is diffuse at best? Today, the evidence suggests the latter, and that is the real danger. Freedom is not just about laws. It is about autonomy, choice, and the ability to act without unseen forces steering you. If you allow control to be centralized in entities that are not fully accountable, autonomy disappears. And with autonomy, liberty becomes a memory, not a reality. Freedom is not a single right. It is a collection of rights that reinforce one another. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to innovate, freedom to vote, and freedom from undue surveillance. When any of these are compromised, the entire system suffers. And the danger now is that the erosion is quiet, almost invisible. You wake up one day, and what once seemed normal, a platform deciding what is permissible, a policy shaping what you may read, a contract determining what information you may access, has become your reality. And at that point, resistance becomes far more difficult, far more dangerous. I've often been asked why I speak publicly about political matters. I could remain silent, continue building rockets, cars, and satellites, and focus solely on technological challenges. But silence is complicity. I have seen how quickly authority accumulates when unchecked. I have seen how power structures evolve from protection to control. And I have seen how the same forces that shape innovation in one sector can shape compliance and obedience in another. So I speak, not because I want attention, but because I believe that those who have a platform have a duty to warn. And make no mistake, freedom does not survive passively. It requires active defense. It is not self-sustaining. Institutions, no matter how noble their original intentions, will drift toward control unless held accountable by the people they serve. Democracy is not a machine that runs unattended. It is a process, a conversation, a constant negotiation between authority and liberty. And if that conversation is replaced with algorithms, policies, and opaque decisions, the voice of the individual disappears. The core issue in Washington is trust. Citizens must be able to trust that decisions are made transparently, that accountability exists, and that the rights of the individual are protected. But increasingly, that trust is being eroded. Citizens are treated as data points, as metrics, as units of compliance. Decisions are justified in the abstract, for security, for efficiency, for modernization. But in practice, these justifications often serve the interests of the system itself, rather than the people it governs. So what must happen? First, transparency must be non-negotiable. Platforms, agencies, contractors, and policymakers must be required to make their processes, algorithms, and decision-making pathways visible. Without visibility, there can be no accountability. Second, accountability must be meaningful. It is not enough to have oversight committees or internal audits. The individuals whose lives are affected must have a real voice in the decisions that impact them. Third, citizen empowerment must be prioritized over centralized control. Freedom is only meaningful when it is lived, not merely administered. I've spent my life building ambitious projects, rockets that defy gravity, vehicles that challenge convention, satellites that connect the planet. But the most ambitious project of all is the defense of freedom itself. Without freedom, the technologies we celebrate become hollow achievements. Without freedom, innovation is constrained. Without freedom, the future is dictated, not discovered. So to the policymakers in Washington, I say this: the time to act is now. Do not wait for a crisis to force your hand. Do not assume that citizens will remain silent indefinitely. Do not confuse compliance with consent. The systems you build today and the choices you make will determine the trajectory of liberty for generations. Delay may feel convenient, but it is dangerous. The more inertia you allow, the harder it becomes to reclaim what is being lost. And to the citizens, I say, stay vigilant. Engage with your representatives. Demand transparency. Question authority. Protect your voice. Because the truth is simple. The oxygen of democracy is freedom. When the air thins, everything else becomes irrelevant. The rockets can orbit. The cars can drive. The satellites can beam signals across the globe. But if liberty is compromised, those achievements will mean little. The future belongs to those who act to preserve freedom, not those who assume it is permanent. History has shown that democracy and liberty are not guaranteed. They are earned, defended, and fought for. Every generation faces choices: to protect freedom or to let it fade. The warning is clear, the danger is present, and the time for action is immediate. Do not mistake convenience for wisdom or silence for consent. The foundation of progress is freedom, and if the foundation cracks, everything else is at risk. Freedom is fading faster than most people realize. The air is thinning. The time to act is now. And I, Elon Musk, am here to tell you, do not wait. Preserve freedom before it is too late. Because once it is gone, even the most advanced technologies, the boldest innovations, and the brightest visions cannot restore what liberty once gave you. Let's get real about Washington's role in this. When I warn that freedom is fading faster than you think, I am not pointing fingers at some distant, abstract entity. I am pointing directly at the very systems designed to protect liberty. It is easy to assume that because these institutions were founded with noble intentions, they remain benevolent. But intentions alone do not guarantee outcomes. Institutions, like individuals, drift over time, and without constant oversight, that drift can become dangerous. The capital city is filled with bright minds, ambitious careers, and complex bureaucracies. On paper, these structures are meant to protect the citizen, ensure justice, and maintain transparency. In practice, they often operate as self-sustaining machines. Budgets grow, agencies expand, decision-making becomes opaque, processes multiply. What began as a protective measure becomes a tool of control, whether intentionally or not. And the individuals who should be empowered by these systems, the citizens themselves, find their freedoms quietly constrained. I've spent decades working on projects where the stakes are tangible. Rockets that must reach orbit, cars that must function safely, satellites that must connect people globally. In these domains, failure is immediate, measurable, and expensive. But in governance, the stakes are far greater, even if the consequences are slower, less visible, and therefore easier to ignore. When freedom erodes gradually, most people do not notice until it is nearly impossible to reverse. By the time citizens awaken to the reality, the mechanisms of control are entrenched, and the options for reclaiming autonomy are severely limited. Consider the subtle ways in which freedom is fading when platforms selectively suppress content under the guise of moderation. It is not censorship in the obvious sense, but the effect is the same. Your voice is limited. When national security or public safety is invoked, bureaucracies gain the power to bypass oversight and accountability, often without public knowledge. When data collected for one purpose is repurposed without consent, citizens lose agency over their own information. When decisions affecting millions are outsourced to private contractors, the line between public accountability and private interest becomes dangerously blurred, and these trends are compounding. Algorithms shape narratives, platforms control access, governments outsource oversight. Citizens, the very people the system was designed to serve, are reduced to numbers, statistics, and data points. This is not theory. This is reality, and it is precisely why I speak out. You might ask why I, a technologist and entrepreneur, am focused on politics. The answer is simple. Freedom is the foundation on which all innovation rests. Without the liberty to speak, act, and challenge assumptions, progress stagnates. Without the ability to experiment, to question authority, to dissent, true creativity cannot flourish. And when governments, institutions, and corporations converge to control the narrative, innovation is not just limited, it is coerced, channeled, and constrained. Washington must understand one simple principle. Freedom is not a commodity that can be managed or optimized. It is a living process, an active engagement between the individual and the systems that govern them. When freedom is treated as a line item on a spreadsheet, it becomes vulnerable. When it is treated as an abstract ideal rather than a practical reality, it can be quietly erased. The danger, in part, comes from the subtlety of the threat. Unlike overt oppression, which is visible and confrontable, the slow erosion of freedom is almost imperceptible. Citizens may notice inconveniences, small limitations, or subtle shifts in policy, but rarely see the structural changes that aggregate into significant loss of liberty. By the time the erosion is clear, the mechanisms are entrenched, and the fight to restore autonomy is uphill and arduous. Consider this. When speech is algorithmically curated, what you see and what you do not see is determined by entities whose priorities may not align with yours. When civic engagement is guided by opaque systems, your choices become framed by forces you cannot perceive. When your vote is counted but your voice is shaped beforehand, freedom becomes an illusion. You may participate, but participation does not equal empowerment. You may speak, but speaking does not equal influence. Freedom is a network, a collection of rights that reinforce one another. It is not a single law, a single amendment, or a single institution. It is the interplay of expression, choice, privacy, and agency. When one node in that network is compromised, the others are weakened. And right now, I see multiple nodes under strain. Speech, privacy, political participation, and institutional transparency. The role of technology in this equation is particularly critical. I've spent my life creating tools that expand human potential. But the same tools in the wrong hands can limit potential, centralize power, and constrain freedom. Algorithms that determine what information reaches you, platforms that shape discourse, data systems that predict behavior. They are neutral in theory, but they reflect the intentions of their operators in practice. When these operators include both government institutions and private contractors, the risk of misalignment with citizen interests rises exponentially. The question in Washington should not be, how do we control these systems efficiently? The question should be, how do we preserve the freedom of the citizen while leveraging the capabilities of technology? Efficiency without liberty is tyranny disguised as progress. Security without autonomy is oppression disguised as protection. Modernization without transparency is manipulation disguised as innovation. And that is why I keep sounding the alarm. This is not theoretical. This is happening. The systems of power are drifting toward centralization. The individual is losing agency, and the structures that once protected liberty are quietly redefining it. History has shown us that centralization of control, even with the best intentions, eventually leads to reduced freedom. What we are seeing now is the early stages of a process that, if left unchecked, could fundamentally reshape the citizen-government relationship. The stakes could not be higher. If we fail to act, we risk creating a society where liberty is a memory, where participation is symbolic, and where dissent is discouraged, subtle, and muted. Citizens may go about their lives, unaware that the freedoms they assumed were permanent are, in fact, increasingly fragile. By the time awareness grows, the systems constraining freedom may be too entrenched to easily dismantle. That is why I say, as bluntly as possible, the time to act is now. Transparency must be non-negotiable. Accountability must be real and enforceable. Citizens must be empowered, not silenced. Platforms must be open to scrutiny, and government decisions must be visible and challengeable. Without these safeguards, freedom will continue to erode quietly, efficiently, and invisibly. We have a choice. We can allow this drift toward centralized control, algorithmic influence, and bureaucratic opacity to continue, or we can actively defend the rights, agency, and autonomy of the individual. Freedom is not self-sustaining. It must be protected, maintained, and actively preserved. And the responsibility for that preservation falls on both policymakers and citizens alike. I have spent my life launching rockets, building cars, connecting the globe. I have always believed that the future should be something we create, not something imposed upon us. But the most important launch of all, the launch of a society that values and protects freedom, cannot happen without awareness, courage, and action. It is not a task for the faint-hearted. It is not a task for the passive. It is a task for those willing to defend liberty, even when it is inconvenient, even when it challenges authority, and even when the mechanisms of power are opaque and complex. So I issue this warning once again. Freedom is fading faster than most people realize. The air is thinning. Systems designed to protect liberty are drifting toward control. Citizens, the very people these systems are meant to serve, are quietly losing agency. And unless both policymakers and citizens recognize the danger and act decisively, the erosion will continue and the future will be diminished. History rewards those who notice early and act boldly. It punishes those who wait. And today, the choice is ours. Act now, defend freedom, insist on transparency, and protect the autonomy of the individual. Because without liberty, all the progress, all the innovation, and all the ambition in the world will ultimately be meaningless. Freedom is not guaranteed. It is not permanent. It is earned, preserved, and defended. And it is up to us today to ensure that it survives. Here's the crucial point. When people start saying, "This is just the cost of progress," you know the conversation has gone off the rails. I've heard it too often from policymakers and pundits alike. We must centralize to coordinate. We must regulate to keep up. We must optimize to compete. All of these sound reasonable on the surface, logical, even rational, but the real question is, coordinate what? Regulate for whom? Optimize toward which end? Efficiency alone does not preserve liberty, and coordination alone does not protect autonomy. Freedom is not a line item. It is not a metric that can be optimized or engineered. It is living, dynamic, and often messy. It is the clash of ideas, the argument in the streets, the voices that dissent. It allows for mistakes, failures, and contradictions. And that messiness, as inconvenient as it may seem to bureaucrats, is not a flaw. It is the feature that ensures society remains vibrant, adaptable, and capable of progress. I've spent my career creating ambitious technologies, rockets that defy gravity, cars that defy convention, satellites that connect the world. But every technological breakthrough rests on one fundamental foundation: freedom. Without the liberty to experiment, to challenge norms, and to dissent from the status quo, innovation stagnates. Without freedom, ambition becomes compliance, creativity becomes calculation, and progress becomes predictable and limited. Now, imagine the opposite scenario. Washington increasingly centralizes control, outsourcing decisions to algorithms, contractors, or private firms, all in the name of efficiency or security. You may think you are free to speak, free to vote, free to innovate, but each choice is subtly shaped by forces outside your awareness. Platforms decide what content you see. Government agencies guide public discourse through policy and influence. Data is harvested, analyzed, and repurposed to predict and shape behavior. Slowly, imperceptibly, autonomy diminishes. The danger of gradual erosion is that it often appears benign. Citizens go about their daily lives, unaware that the systems surrounding them are quietly limiting freedom. You may notice inconveniences, a post removed, a vote delayed, a policy framed narrowly, but the cumulative effect is far more significant than any single incident. It is the architecture of control, not the occasional restriction, that threatens liberty. And that architecture is quietly being built. I want to make this crystal clear. Efficiency without liberty is tyranny disguised as progress. Security without autonomy is oppression disguised as protection. Regulation without transparency is control disguised as innovation. And modernization without accountability is manipulation disguised as advancement. These are not abstract warnings. They are observable trends unfolding today right under our noses. The real challenge is cultural, systemic, and institutional. Systems are naturally prone to growth and self-preservation. Agencies expand, budgets increase, oversight diminishes. The more control a system accumulates, the less likely it is to be questioned. And the more people internalize the rules imposed upon them, the more freedom is lost. Not through rebellion, but through compliance. The critical difference between freedom and control lies in noise. Freedom is loud, messy, and full of disagreement. It is the cacophony of voices, ideas, and challenges that prevent stagnation and keep power accountable. Control, by contrast, is quiet, streamlined, and uniform. It removes friction, reduces debate, and encourages compliance. The temptation for any institution, especially those in Washington, is to value the latter because it appears efficient, tidy, and manageable. But efficiency at the cost of dissent is the death of liberty. We must remember that the erosion of freedom is not always visible in the short term. Unlike a coup or a sudden authoritarian decree, this is incremental, almost imperceptible. A small restriction here, a subtle manipulation there, a new guideline justified as efficiency or security. The cumulative effect is a system where autonomy exists in theory, but not in practice. The choices you think are yours have already been shaped, filtered, and constrained. I've seen it firsthand in technology. Algorithms that curate content, predict behavior, or prioritize engagement are neutral tools, but the way they are applied can influence, nudge, or constrain human action. When these tools intersect with governance without transparency, the consequences for freedom are profound. What begins as guidance becomes direction, and direction over time becomes control. The citizen is no longer empowered. They are channeled. This is why my warning is urgent. Freedom cannot survive passively. It is not a natural state. It must be actively defended every day, in every decision, in every interaction between citizens and the systems that govern them. Transparency must be enforced. Accountability must be meaningful, and citizens must retain true agency over their lives. Without these protections, freedom becomes a memory, a relic of a time when choice and autonomy were respected. I do not issue this warning lightly. I have dedicated my life to building things that expand human potential. I have witnessed firsthand the difference between constraint and autonomy, control and empowerment. And I recognize the same principles apply to society at large. Freedom is the soil in which innovation grows. Remove it, and even the brightest ideas cannot flourish. Remove it, and even the most powerful technology becomes irrelevant. Washington and the citizens it serves faces a stark choice. You can allow the drift towards centralized control, opaque decision-making, and algorithmic influence to continue unchecked. Or you can act decisively to restore transparency, enforce accountability, and reassert citizen agency. The first path is easier for those in power. It is quieter, more convenient, and less confrontational. But it is also far more dangerous. It risks creating a society in which liberty is symbolic, participation is performative, and dissent is muted. I've always believed in pushing boundaries. Whether it's the laws of physics or the expectations of society, But the most important boundary to protect is the one that defines the space in which all other achievements occur, the boundary of freedom itself. Without it, rockets cannot launch, innovations cannot scale, and society cannot progress. The technical challenges I face in my companies pale in comparison to the challenge of preserving liberty in the face of systemic drift and quiet erosion. The future will not wait. Systems of power will not yield voluntarily. And freedom is not guaranteed. The citizens, the people who live in this democracy, must rise to defend it. This requires awareness, courage, and action. It requires asking difficult questions, challenging authority, and demanding that the structures of power serve the public rather than themselves. It requires recognizing that the air is thinning and choosing to act before it becomes impossible to breathe freely. So hear me clearly. The time to act is now. The stakes are enormous. The institutions of governance are drifting toward control, subtle but powerful. The citizenry is at risk of losing autonomy, voice, and agency. And unless both policymakers and citizens recognize the danger and intervene, freedom will continue to fade quietly, efficiently, and almost imperceptibly. History rewards those who notice early and act boldly. It punishes those who wait. And today, the choice is ours. Defend transparency. Demand accountability, protect the voice of the individual, preserve the autonomy that is the foundation of all innovation and progress. Because without liberty, all the technology, all the ambition, and all the vision in the world will be meaningless. Freedom is not guaranteed. It is not permanent. It must be earned, preserved, and defended. And the moment to ensure its survival is now. We've reached the point where the urgency of the situation cannot be overstated. By now, it should be clear that freedom is not merely under pressure, it is actively eroding. And unlike the challenges I face building rockets, cars, or satellites, this erosion cannot be measured in dollars, efficiency, or launch success rates. It is measured in the slow disappearance of agency, choice, and autonomy. Every decision deferred, every process made opaque, every subtle shift in regulation chips away at the foundation of liberty. And the consequences are profound, not just for today, but for generations to come. The warning I have been issuing is simple. Freedom is not self-sustaining. It is not guaranteed. It requires active defense, and the responsibility for that defense falls on every citizen and every policymaker who values liberty. Washington can no longer assume that by maintaining appearances, freedom is safe. The systems that govern us, no matter how well-intentioned, have a natural tendency to centralize, to control, and to constrain. Without vigilance, those tendencies become dominant, and liberty quietly fades. Consider this carefully. The erosion of freedom is rarely dramatic. Unlike an authoritarian coup or a violent suppression, the slow decline of liberty is subtle, incremental, and almost invisible. A policy change here, a subtle regulation there, a technological tool applied for efficiency or for security, these do not scream oppression. They appear benign, yet their cumulative effect is a reduction in autonomy, a narrowing of choices, and a quiet reshaping of the landscape in which citizens operate. This is the most dangerous form of erosion, because it lulls people into complacency while fundamentally altering the relationship between individuals and the institutions that govern them. Technology amplifies both the possibilities of freedom and the mechanisms of control. I have spent my life building technology that expands human potential. Rockets that reach orbit, cars that redefine transportation, satellites that connect remote regions. But the same technologies in the hands of opaque institutions or centralized powers can be used to shape behavior, control narratives, and constrain choice. When the tools of innovation are intertwined with bureaucratic control, the stakes become existential. Autonomy is threatened, and freedom becomes performative rather than real. What I see in Washington today is a convergence of factors that heightens the risk: centralized decision-making, outsourced accountability, algorithmically mediated communication, and opaque governance. Each of these alone is concerning, but together they form a system where citizen agency is eroded systematically, often without public awareness. Decisions are made behind closed doors, guided by contractors, consultants, and advisory bodies that are largely unaccountable to the people they affect. Platforms decide what content is visible, what discourse is amplified, and what is muted. Data is collected, analyzed, and repurposed to anticipate and shape behavior. Slowly, invisibly, autonomy diminishes. The lesson from history is clear. Liberty cannot be preserved passively. Democracies do not survive by default. Institutions that are not actively monitored tend toward centralization, and centralization tends toward restriction. When people assume that freedom is permanent, when citizens take agency for granted, erosion accelerates unnoticed. And by the time the problem becomes visible, the mechanisms constraining liberty are deeply entrenched, making recovery difficult and costly. So what is to be done? The answer is multifaceted. First, transparency must be non-negotiable. Platforms, agencies, contractors, and policymakers must make their decision-making processes clear and visible. Citizens must have insight into how policies are formed, how data is used, and how algorithms shape outcomes. Without visibility, there can be no meaningful accountability. Second, accountability must be enforceable. Oversight committees, audits, and reviews are not enough if they operate in abstraction, or if their findings are ignored. Individuals who control systems that shape public behavior and policy must answer to the citizens those systems affect. Enforcement must be meaningful, consequences must be tangible, and compliance must be real. Third, citizens themselves must reclaim agency. Freedom is not simply granted. It is exercised. Voting, speaking, engaging with policymakers, questioning authority, and holding institutions accountable are not optional. They are essential acts of self-preservation in a democracy. The collective inaction of the public is the most effective tool of those who wish to erode liberty. Silence is compliance, and passivity accelerates the loss of freedom. Fourth, cultural vigilance is essential. Freedom thrives in a society that values debate, dissent, and diversity of thought. When conformity is valued over disagreement, when noise is punished and predictability rewarded, liberty declines. A healthy democracy is inherently messy, loud, and at times frustrating. That is its strength. That is its defense. I have spent decades building things that seemed impossible. Rockets that defy gravity, cars that challenge convention, satellites that connect the farthest corners of the globe. And the principle that guided every endeavor was the same: empower the individual, maximize agency, and challenge constraints. Freedom in every sense is the foundation of progress. Without it, even the most brilliant technology or most ambitious vision is irrelevant. Now consider this: the erosion of freedom is not a distant threat. It is happening right now. Systems designed to serve the public are slowly being repurposed to control behavior. Decisions are being centralized, data is being repurposed, and citizens are being subtly constrained without even realizing it. And because this happens gradually, the danger is not immediately obvious. By the time the effects are visible, the structures of control are entrenched and difficult to dismantle. The stakes could not be higher. Liberty is the oxygen of democracy. Without it, participation is meaningless, innovation is stifled, and society stagnates. The rockets may still launch, the cars may still drive, the satellites may still orbit, but if freedom is compromised, the human potential these technologies unlock is diminished. The future becomes dictated rather than discovered. And so I issue this final warning: the air is thinning. The time to act is now. Citizens must demand transparency, insist on accountability, reclaim their agency, and defend the space in which freedom exists. Policymakers must recognize the drift toward centralization and act decisively to preserve liberty rather than allow convenience, efficiency, or expedience to erode it. History will judge this moment not by the technologies we built, nor by the efficiencies we achieved, but by whether we preserve the fundamental principles that allow a society to thrive: freedom, agency, and autonomy. We have the choice to act boldly, decisively, and collectively, or to watch as liberty quietly fades, leaving a society constrained, compliant, and diminished. Freedom is fragile. Freedom is resilient, But above all, freedom must be actively defended. It does not survive by assumption, by convenience, or by passive compliance. The choice is ours. Act now, defend liberty, and ensure that the future is one in which the individual, not the system, determines their destiny. Because without freedom, all the innovation, all the progress, and all the ambition in the world is meaningless. The air is thinning. Freedom is fading faster than most people realize. The moment to act is now, and the responsibility belongs to all of us, policymakers, citizens, and innovators alike. Protect liberty before it is too late. History will not forgive inaction, and the future depends on those willing to stand for freedom today.